A very warm welcome to everyone, and hello wherever you might be in the world today. So I'll say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what time zone you're in. Those of you who have joined a few minutes ago will have had time already to read the aims and objectives for today, but they're on the slide at the moment. I'd just like you to take a read through those. I'll draw attention to the first point because we want to be positive today and focus on what we can do with remote learning. We all know what's not possible to do, so we don't want to get down into moaning and complaining about that. We want to be positive and think what we can do to help our students. I also want to draw attention to the second to last point, developing something you can use with students. As Charlene said, this is an interactive session today, so if you do participate in it, you could end up with something that you can actually use straight away with your students, which is always useful. We'll be sharing good practice as well, so there'll be opportunity for each of you to have input into things that you're doing. And anytime you see that little icon at the bottom, it's just on the PowerPoint, so you can't click on it or anything. Anytime you see that little speech icon, that's an invitation for you to use the chat box facility that Charlene was telling you about. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is just for yourself, you don't need to share this, just make a list of any additional objectives that you might have. We call them personal objectives. I'll just give you a few seconds to do that. So personal objectives are things that you are expecting to achieve today that are not already on that list. Okay, and you don't need to share those. We'll come back and revisit them at the end. Okay. So a little bit about me then. I came into teaching reasonably late, as a lot of teachers do, not all of them, but some of them do. And as you can see from my background there, I started off doing scientific research. So I class myself as a scientist. And I always think in science, you may agree or disagree with this, but I always think in science teachers fall into one of two categories. You're either a scientist who happens to teach, or you're a teacher who happens to teach science. And I'm definitely the first one of those. I don't think it makes any bit of difference whatsoever, because in the school where I was head of department, the lady who taught biology there, she taught biology right up to A level. She was a teacher very much, and she said to me she had no interest whatsoever in biology, and I was quite taken aback at that, but she achieved outstanding results with her students, which is, I suppose, is all that really matters. I normally do face-to-face training as well as this, and under normal circumstances I'd be out in one of your countries now actually working with you, and usually in November I'm in Malaysia and Indonesia. Some of you who are a little bit observant may notice that my accent is slightly different. I don't have an English accent. My accent comes from Belfast in Northern Ireland, a city that some of you may have heard of. It's had a pretty checkered history, actually, but more recently it's become famous because of the Titanic. And actually my grandfather worked in the shipyard that built the Titanic. But don't blame him, because he joined there about 10 years afterwards. Okay, if you've got any questions about me, either now or through the session, please enter those into the chat box. Okay. So we've now got some polls for you so that I can get some sort of understanding of what your backgrounds are and your experience.
Okay, so sorry, Michael, I was going to say, if you click on the poll function at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see there's a variety of questions there, and just go in and select how you feel you match. We'll give you a minute or so to fill this in. Okay, so far we've got about 25% of people voted. So if you can keep on adding, I will stop the vote once we reach about 50% of people. So
it's really helpful for us actually, because it gives us a clue as to how we interpret the answers that you give and so on. So it's really useful that we have this information.
well, this is great. We've got lots of people voting. So I'm going to close the vote in 10 seconds. So all right, it looks like we've slowed down there. So I'm going to stop it now. And I'll share the results with everyone so you can see Michael as well.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so we've got a pretty even split between biologists and chemists today, and some physicists. A lot of people teaching A-level, which is great. A lot of subject teachers, which is brilliant. A lot of very experienced teachers as well. We always find in any training session, new teachers can often bring new, fresh ideas, and the more experienced teachers can speak from their experience, and together you can get some really good input. So that's superb. And a lot of people from Cambridge schools as well, which is fantastic, because a lot of the resources we'll be using today are specific for the Cambridge syllabus.
Okay, I'll stop sharing the results now, if that's okay, Michael.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thanks for that. That was useful. So thanks again for your input. Okay, so what can we do then? Well, the main skill areas for practical skills are shown there. You can subdivide them any way you want, but essentially we're looking at 5 skill areas that students need to master to be able to perform well in practical skills assessments. And these practical skills assessments in Cambridge are assessed at A-level in paper 3 or paper 5 as well, for all 3 sciences. So I'm not going to run through all what they are, but what I would like you to do using the chat box is to just type in which of those skill areas, which of those 5 skill areas we can practice without access to a laboratory. Okay, so if you just type in what you think in your chat box.
We've got planning.
Yep, definitely planning. Yep, because you don't have to actually do anything to plan. You think about what method you're going to use, the equipment you're going to use. You think about the variables that you're going to change. You're
We've
going to
got
measure.
Presenting. Most difficult in this area is measuring and recording.
Mm-hmm.
All of them except measuring, someone says. So
yep.
We've got a mix of different ones here.
Yeah, I would tend to agree that you can actually do all of these. Measuring and recording will probably be the most difficult to do remotely. But what I'd also like you to do, goes along with this, is to look at the list again, and bearing in mind what each of those involve, you're going to see some poll questions now. Charlene's going to put up some poll questions.
So the first one is, which of these skills do students find most challenging? I've launched that one now on the poll. Yep. So if you can add your votes there.
And I guess what you could think of here is not what they find most challenging, but not just what they find most challenging, but what they find challenging to do well in. Okay, because just because a student finds something challenging doesn't mean to say they don't do well in it. So if you're from your own experience teaching or marking work, whatever, which of these do students not really perform well in?
So I'm going to stop the vote there.
Yep.
It looks like we've leveled out a little bit, and I'll share the results with you. It looks like analysing is the winner here.
Yep, I would say analysing or even evaluating as well. Very few people went for evaluating. And if you think about Bloom's taxonomy or any sort of hierarchical way of thinking like that, analysing and evaluating are at the top of those. And it's actually quite fortunate for us that those are ones that we can practice without having access to a laboratory. And
so now I'm going to launch the next poll, which is, which of these skills do students find easiest to achieve well? So I'll put that in now.
So if you were getting students to demonstrate these practical skills, what would you expect to see them perform best in?
Okay, so got quite a few people voting.
Good.
I'll leave it up there for a few more minutes. I mean seconds, not minutes, because otherwise we'll be here forever. Okay, here we go. I'll stop the poll now and share the results.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Measuring and recording. If students are trained how to do this, they can generally do it pretty well. And that's good for us because, of course, that's the one that's most difficult for us to do without access to a lab. So all this fits pretty well with our agenda today. Okay, thanks for that, Charlene. The other thing that you may have noticed there, I wasn't planning on talking about, but I'll just mention this very briefly. When a poll like that goes up, you take a few seconds to read through it, assimilate the information and respond. And just remember that students need that time as well. Research shows that many teachers will ask a student a question or a class of students a question and not give them sufficient time to think about it. So just remember, particularly at AS and A level, if you're asking a question based on content or understanding or practical skills, do give them some time to think about it. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at an example physics task. For those of you who aren't physics specialists, don't worry. We're going to have a look at a biology one and a chemistry one as well. But this physics task is taken from pages 120 and 121 of the Collins ASA level physics student book. And this book has been written specifically for the Cambridge syllabus 9702. And as you can see from the image up on the right, it's endorsed by Cambridge for full syllabus coverage. So they're happy that it covers everything that we need to do. We're going to look at an experimental skills section. And what I'd like you to do when we get to the second slide of this, you're going to see the questions that we're asking students to do. And I would like you to attempt to map those questions to the 5 different skill areas that we talked about. So let's have a look. This slide just shows the background to the experiment. And I should mention that one of the big advantages of the Collins experimental skills sections is these are specifically written so that students don't have to do the experiment. It was way before lockdown or any school closures, planned school closures, that we wrote this. It was written so that teachers could do these as dry exercises, or alternatively, if they had the equipment, they could do the experiment. So this experiment is about finding the efficiency of an electric motor. And you've got a little joule meter measuring the electrical energy supplied to the motor. And then we calculate the energy output of the motor from these masses that are raised up through a certain height. So that's the background to the experiment. And on the next page, we get the questions. And as you'll see from these, students don't have to do the experiment, actually physically do it, to be able to answer the questions. So I'd like you to look at those different questions from P1 through to P9 and decide which of those skill areas on the left are covered by those questions. And we'll give you a few minutes to do that. When you get some ideas, just use the chat box. So the question we're asking here effectively is, like for P1, for example, suggest a suitable range and interval of masses to use. Which of the 5 skill areas is that? So on. So
we've got a few people saying the text is quite small. Yes, and we're sorry about that. It was quite difficult to include all of the questions onto one slide. But so we've got P1 planning.
Yes.
Or P1 analysing.
Okay,
P2
yes.
Evaluating.
Yes.
That's what we've got so far. So
P1 primarily is planning, but yes, it will come into analysing because you'll have to think about that in terms of plotting a graph, definitely. For those of you who've done this experiment, actually, the results are quite interesting because the efficiency of the motor varies according to the masses that it's lifting. If you think about it, that makes sense because if the motor's working harder to lift larger masses, it's going to get hotter, and that is wasted thermal energy, so it lowers the efficiency. But even students could be asked to think about things like that whenever they're doing it. P4. Question P4 is essentially asking that type of question, why we keep the wires between the geometer and the motor as short as possible. What skill area do you think that is?
I've got someone saying P2 could be planning, P4 could be evaluating.
Yeah, P4 is evaluating, yes, and planning as well, because you would expect the students, when they're writing a plan, to justify what they're doing so the results are as accurate as possible. So one way of doing that is not use excessively long wires.
I've now got, someone else has put P3 analysing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
P9 planning.
Yes, P9's planning. Incidentally, we'll just pick up on question P9 at this point. This, for those of you familiar with the Cambridge physics syllabus, this task on, it's from the AS content, work, energy and power. All the questions from P1 to P8 can be answered by AS students, but sometimes what we have is students doing the full A-level coming back to a task like this, and they can do the A-level analysis, or teachers can start to introduce that A-level analysis for students who are going to be continuing to do the full A-level. Okay. Good. So we've had a good range of responses there, and the way these experimental skills sections are written, we're pretty much trying to cover all of these skill areas from there. So things like this can be done from home. They don't need access to a laboratory. You just need to decide how to manage this, how you're going to provide the students with the task, and how you're going to get the responses back again. Okay. So what I've done here is I've mapped what I think the skill areas are matching. So we've matched all of them there. Below those bullet points, I just draw your attention to the scaffolding in question 9. Scaffolding is structured support. AS students won't be used to writing in this level of detail, so we structure them through it. And then we gradually reduce the level of scaffolding as we go further through the course and through the book. So if we just look at the next slide, it shows the way we take them through. So prompt them by identifying the independent, dependent control variables and list them. And we would expect here for them to justify some sort of equipment choice as well. Okay, now that was from chapter 5 in the book, which is Work, Energy and Power. Just jumping ahead a little bit to chapter 8 in the same book, I've just pulled out here the A-level analysis question from that experimental skills section, and you can see here how the scaffolding is greatly reduced. Okay, so we're expecting the students to develop these skills and need less support as they go along. And just remember, whenever you're trying to introduce these skills, they are higher level skills with your students, to provide that support. And then you will know, knowing your students, when to gradually withdraw that support. If you withdraw it too soon, they're going to lose confidence. They don't know what to do. That's going to be disastrous potentially. So you want to be careful about withdrawing the support at a controlled level. And of course, in a big class of students, that won't be the same for all of them. And that's the difficult thing to manage. You know each student, you know which ones need more support, which ones need more challenge. That's all about differentiation. Okay. I've pulled out here just so that we give a balanced coverage of all three sciences. I've pulled out here an example from the Collins ASA level biology textbook, and this is written for Cambridge syllabus 9700. And the experimental skills in chapter 8 of this one is about using a hemocytometer to count cells. So obviously we can't expect students to have a microscope, a hemocytometer at home, and certainly not take blood samples. So we can still assess those skills and rehearse those skills here by using an example like this. And the chemistry one here, this one's been screenshotted across 2 pages. That's why there's the white line there. And this is from the chemistry AS content, an experiment to find the MR of a volatile liquid as well. And you can see the scaffolding in that as well. The students are given equations and shown how to substitute values into those. So that's all scaffolding as well, that level of support. Okay. So we've talked about what it's possible to do in terms of supporting these skills remotely. Students at home, they don't have access to a lab. What we'd like to find out now is what you're already doing. We've seen some of you have been remote teaching. Would anyone like to share some ideas in the chat box about what they've been doing that's been particularly successful?
So we do have a few questions as well, which is separate to this. So while people are thinking about what they've been doing well, maybe we can answer, we'll answer one of them.
Yes.
So we've got here a question, how to teach students for skills that they're not familiar with, such as gene therapy. This teacher, however, is not remote teaching, but in most schools, it may not be possible to do the practicals for gene therapy. So how would you go about this?
Definitely not. Science is, let's just say something general about science here and the issues that science teachers have compared to teachers of other subjects. A lot of other subjects, like languages and mathematics, for example, are skills-based. But science is different in that there are skills and content as well, content to be learned. So whenever you're doing a topic like gene therapy, for example, you've got to be absolutely certain that the students are well grounded in the content before you can look at any experimental skills. One of the things that's used in gene therapy is electrophoresis, gel electrophoresis, where samples of DNA are separated um, on a gel, agarose gel, and then stained so that you can see them. And it's possible to find images of those on websites, for example, and you can ask students to interpret, for example, the sizes of the fragments. I mean, that would be quite a basic skill to start off with, because the smaller fragments travel further on the gel, the larger fragments don't travel so far, things like that. So that's observing and interpreting, for example. So that's the way I would approach that.
Great, thank you, Michael.
Yep.
We've had a few people put in the chat box some of their successes. So
okay, good.
A few people, if when you're typing into the chat box, if you want to make sure all attendees can see your answers, please select the two, all panelists and attendees, so everyone can see. I think some people have put that in. So some people have said the use of simulations has been successful.
Yes. Yep.
Especially for lower secondary science.
Yes.
Another person has said, like what you shared before, so using scaffolding and making it less after a few discussions, so
yep.
reducing the scaffolding.
Just going back to the simulations, actually, those can be really good, particularly at lower secondary, even in the classroom, even if you have access to a classroom and a laboratory, because, I mean, for example, in lower secondary, there's part of the curriculum that deals with frequency, amplitude, pitch of sound, things like that, and you may not have access to an oscilloscope and a signal generator, so the equipment to do that. So there are some excellent online simulations for that as well. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's similar to what some people have put here, like showing videos in virtual labs, using demonstration videos so they can still follow the process, but obviously they're very limited to the experiment that can be done in the school lab. Excuse me. Another person from Malaysia has put using past paper 3, teachers provide data to the students and students required to answer the questions.
Using past papers is very valuable, actually, because students, as you know, have access to the mark schemes on various websites as well. But that's not a bad thing. A lot of teachers are afraid of that. They think, oh, they're just going to copy the answers from the mark scheme. But that can form part of the scaffolding as well, because students looking at those mark schemes can see exactly what the examiners are requiring. But obviously, in line with withdrawing that scaffolding, it's good to develop some of your own assessments that they don't have access to the mark scheme for. But yes, past papers, definitely paper 3, paper 5. Some websites have those going back almost 20 years. I would suggest starting with the more recent ones first of all, because of curriculum changes and style changes as well. Good.
There is a few more. So the titration experiment from past papers with accompanying videos on handling equipment and measuring, recording, presenting, analysis and evaluation questions, discussed step by step with student input. So there's that. And yeah, everyone's just saying simulations from websites such as PHET are very interactive.
Yep.
And students can explore those themselves as well.
Brilliant. Yeah. I mean, you may notice actually, again, if you've been observant, that I refer to students. The official Cambridge terminology is learners, but I don't use that term. I refer to students because I think we're all learners. And in this situation that we find ourselves at the minute, a global pandemic with school closures and so on, it's a very steep learning curve for us as well. So that's why I don't call the students learners. We're all learning. Okay, so it sounds like some really good stuff going on out there. Now, what we're going to do is in this webinar and in future ones, we're going to be focusing on the different skills and what we can do to support each of those. So today we're going to start with planning. And planning here, I'd like you to start off by thinking what must be included in a plan. Now, It's up to you to decide whether you're thinking about AS level here or the full A level. I'd probably encourage you to think about full A level, because those are the skills that students are going to need to develop eventually. So what must be included in a plan? And you can use the chat box to enter your ideas there.
Okay. While we're waiting for people to include their answers on the chat box, we could maybe answer one question that came out of the previous conversation was, could you suggest some useful simulation links?
Yes, I can do. Charlene, you were going to share an email address with the participants at the end. Perhaps it would be a good idea, because I mean, I don't want to start reading out URL web addresses orally. It might be a good idea if we were to put a list together and then we can send those to people.
Of course, yes, we can do that. So
yeah. You've got to remember, of course, that any third-party website like that we would refer to is not endorsed. It's not endorsed by Collins. It's probably not endorsed by Cambridge either. So these third-party websites, you've got to decide whether they're suitable for your students or not.
Okay, so we've got a few answers from this activity.
Okay, yep.
So what must be included in a plan? We've got lesson purpose. The variables, the independent variables should be distinct, and
yep.
Their knowledge about variables, procedures, expected results.
Yep.
The aim of the experiment.
Yep.
Someone else has put aims, outcomes, expected results, and variables. So they're all very similar, I think.
Yep. Yep. Okay, so I've summarized here what I would like to see and what Cambridge like to see in an A-level plan as well. You're correct in identifying the variables. That's absolutely key. And it may surprise you to know that a lot of students, or maybe not surprise you if you've a lot of classroom experience, that some students, even at A-level, can get independent and dependent variables mixed up. And one of the reasons for that is how they're explained sometimes. And you might have your own way of doing it, but when I was teaching, I found the easiest way to do this is say, what depends on what? So for example, if you've got maybe bacteria growing in liquid medium, what does the number of bacteria depend on? And the number of bacteria, because it depends on something else, is the dependent variable. The independent variable in that case could be temperature, could be time, pH, whatever. We would expect the students to give the number and range of an independent variable. So rather than saying, for example, I will change the temperature each time, it's not enough. Nobody could follow that exactly. So that we would expect them to say, we will increase the temperature in steps of 10 degrees C from 0 to 60, something like that. And I always try to encourage students to put in too much detail rather than too little. Make sure that someone else could take this method or plan and follow it exactly, reproduce it. Equipment needed with justification. I mean, it's not sufficient at A-level to say, I will use a measuring cylinder. You would expect them to say something like, I would use a 100 centimeter cube measuring cylinder because the volumes that I will be measuring range between 50 and 100 centimeters cubed, and this will reduce percentage uncertainty, things like that. Justification, why you're using each piece of equipment. We'd also expect them in the plan to say how the results will be analysed as well. So when you get these results, what are you going to do with them? You know, if you're expecting in physics maybe a proportional relationship, what are you going to plot against what? If you're doing a simple pendulum experiment, for example, you're not going to plot the periodic time against the length. You're going to plot t squared against L. So a bit of knowledge of the equation that they're working with, how they're going to get a proportional result. And safety. Standard laboratory rules are assumed. So we assume they're going to be tying their hair back. We assume that they're going to be putting bags under benches so they're not a tripping hazard, but we want something specific to the experiment. So for example, if they're allowing masses to fall on a string or something like that, then you put a sandbox underneath or a cushion to avoid damage to the floor, to avoid people putting their feet under there. If we've got a mass oscillating on a spring, we make sure that the clamp stand is in turn also clamped to the bench, things like that. Okay, so these are the things that we would expect to be included in a plan. Now, what I'd like you to do now, a little activity for you, is choose a practical activity from your subject area, physics, chemistry, biology. Decide how you will ask students to plan for it. So you're going to set the context, the first one. The second one, what do you want them to do? You maybe don't want them to draw up an entire plan. You might want them to just, for example, identify the variables and then devise a set of success criteria. And a lot of people get confused when they hear about success criteria. What are success criteria? Well, it's a list. You can think of it as like a checklist where students, you share it with students, that's most important. You give it to them and you say, look, you know, if you've checked off that you've done all these things, then you've got a pretty good plan. And that previous slide, that could actually form the basis of your success criteria. Right? Success criteria, different from a mark scheme. It's like a checklist of what should be included. Have they done all those things? Okay, so this is the bit then that if you participate in this, you can actually end up with something that you can start using pretty much straight away. So I'll give you a few minutes to think about that then. And as usual, you can use the chat box.
So while we're waiting for
Yep.
people to put this into the chat box, I thought
Yep.
we can maybe go back to, this is one of the questions from the beginning of the presentation, referring back to analysis. So could you help this teacher on how they can help students feel that analysis is not that difficult of a task?
Okay, what I would do in that case is if they're finding it difficult, you need to find out what aspect they're finding difficult. I mean, for example, even in graph plotting, you can break graph plotting down into a number of different skills. I mean, for example, choosing a sensible scale, a linear scale, choosing the scale so that you cover at least half of the grid. And once you identify that, you can then support that skill. So you need to find, with dialogue from them, what aspect of it they find difficult, and then support that. But in general, if they find the task difficult, I would just give them some quite straightforward sets of results to plot. And then, for example, if it's a graph, you might want them to prove that the graph shows a proportional relationship, something like that. So as the X value increases, does the Y value increase by the same factor? You know, things like that.
Great. So we've got one teacher has inputted their activities. So
okay, good.
Apologies, because I'm not a scientist, so I don't want to pronounce this wrong, but gel electrophoresis.
Electrophoresis, yes.
Getting DNA sample.
Yes.
Formation of fragments.
Yes.
And losing and running a gel.
Yes. Okay, so generating fragments, presumably using restriction enzymes. Definitely. You could get them to devise a plan for that.
Don't be shy. Please enter your answers or anything that...
Think about it a bit like group work in a class. I mean, if you've got all your students working in isolation and not communicating with each other, they don't learn so effectively. But yet when they're sharing ideas, we often say bouncing ideas off each other, then that's how we learn. Piaget, the Swiss educationalist, said that learning was a social experience.
And this is what we're hoping to generate today.
I know actually a
Social
lot of school managers aren't supportive of that. I mean, I'm not going to name any countries or cities here, but I've been to places where school managers are insisting that the desks are still in straight rows and the students work individually. Well, okay, there's a time and place for that, but in general, whenever students are discussing ideas with each other constructively, that can really facilitate learning.
Doesn't look like we've got any more suggestions.
Okay, good. I'm sure lots of you have, this is not the easiest thing, to be fair, to type into a chat box, but I'm sure lots of people have got really good ideas, and from the sound of it, a lot of you are doing a lot of very positive stuff already anyway. Okay. Now, we've been answering questions along the way. Opportunity now, I mean, I should say that I can't see the chat box, so I can't see the questions that are coming up. So, yeah. Charlene, I'm relying on you to...
yeah, of course, no problem. So there is one question. So do, as and when you've got a question, do put it into the Q&A box. We have been answering a few, but I do have a few more here. So someone has put here, I'll try to summarize it. So how do we balance the need for experiencing the sensory memory retention of actually doing the experiment versus understanding the theory in a pandemic learning situation?
That's very difficult because obviously what you're talking about there is the development of the manipulation skills in order to manipulate the equipment. And we said at the very start that there are things that we cannot do. Unfortunately, that's one of them. But we can get close to it on some of the simulations. The simulation, for example, that one I spoke about at lower secondary can also be used at A-level, but lower secondary, where you can adjust the pitch or frequency of a sound, you can adjust the oscilloscope settings as well. Some of the simulations will get pretty close to that, but unfortunately they're not a substitute.
Someone else has also asked, of course you can ask more questions, please keep them coming in.
Yes, it's not too late.
In this remote teaching situation, how can you develop skills using a microscope?
Okay, one of the things that students need to know, for example, is how to focus a light microscope, and that's quite a basic skill, which I know some students develop lower down school, but a lot of them still, by the time they get to AS and A level, still not sure how to focus a microscope. I mean, things like choosing the lowest power objective first, positioning the stage closest to that lens, and then focusing by moving the stage away from the lens, things like that. And then once they've got the specimen into the field of view that they want, they can then click the lens turret round to change the objective power, things like that. The theory of how to do it, the theory of how to focus, when to use the coarse focus, when to use the fine focus, things like that.
Thank you.
There are also some good websites that have excellent images taken with light microscopes. So, for example, Science Photo Library. I'll put these in the links document, but you can send students a link to an image, for example, taken through a light microscope, and ask them to make a drawing from it, a plan drawing perhaps, or a detailed drawing from a portion of it.
Excellent. Another question we have is how to make students skilled to answer the ATP paper. I'm not sure.
Okay, the alternative to practical. Yeah, the alternative to practical is probably the easier one to practice than the actual practical. By alternative to practical here, I'm assuming you're referring to the IGCSE. Can I just confirm whether that's correct or not? Maybe.
Yeah, so that was That was some anonymous person,
Okay,
actually, so I'm
okay,
not sure who asked that question.
okay. By alternative to practical, I'm assuming you're referring to IGCSE. The vast majority of schools around the world will opt to do the alternative to practical for IGCSE rather than the actual practical paper. And that's purely because of the logistics of doing it. Most schools have often got very large numbers of students doing the IGCSE, and it's practically very difficult to organize them into a lab to do that properly. Again, that's again where I would suggest past papers come in. But essentially, the alternative to practical paper is assessing the same 5 skills that we've looked at here. I suppose as well, you could regard the A-level paper 5 as being an alternative to practical, because that's the analysis and evaluation paper as well. And again, same skills required for that.
Great. We do have a question about the chemistry A-level book. So how does Colin's A-level chemistry course book develop information literacy skills? I guess you could say that for the other books as well.
Could say that for all of them, yeah, definitely. Again, taking it right back to lower secondary, the Cambridge curriculum for lower secondary has been updated. And if your students are coming up through that system, one of the things that is now on one of the learning outcomes on there is looking at third-party websites, secondary sources, and deciding whether they're biased or whether they're maybe unbiased or reliable, less reliable, whatever. And I would always suggest encouraging students to look at maybe websites from universities, something like that, rather than maybe everybody tends to go straight to Wikipedia. We all do that from time to time. But of course, Wikipedia can just be written by anyone. So they just need to be careful. And also some of these student rooms, Quora, used to be Yahoo Answers and stuff like that as well. I mean, anybody can type answers on that. So just looking at what they can and cannot rely on, where it's come from, who's written it. And also what students will do a lot as well when you get them looking at secondary sources like that is they'll go to some high-powered university website and print off a load of stuff that's like at honors degree level. So make sure they can understand it as well.
And that's all of the questions answered. So well done, Michael. Thank you for answering all of those. If you do have any more.
Perhaps I could just ask a question myself and then answer it. One of the common questions that people do ask, and I was surprised that this didn't come up, maybe someone was thinking it but didn't ask it, is where to start with all of this. You need a starting point. So for example, if you're practicing skills in planning, where do you start? My suggestion here would be take the topics in the same order that they appear in the curriculum. Because if your students are going to be taking the Cambridge exam papers, that's the way the questions are structured as well. The questions are generally structured in the same order as the syllabus. So I would start with the first topic, then work through second topic, and so on. I would do it that way. Although for physics, those of you who teach physics will be aware that the Cambridge syllabus does actually state that the questions in paper 3 and paper 5 at A level do not have to come from the syllabus, so they can use a practical in a different context. Now, don't panic about that. That drives fear into a lot of teachers because they think, oh my goodness, the students can be asked anything. New information, they've got to be provided with that. So it gives you a little bit more scope as a teacher. In physics, you can veer outside the syllabus a little bit. If you find an interesting relationship somewhere between two variables, ask them to plan an experiment on it.
We do have another thing has just come through. Sometimes I've found and felt that an alternative to coursework for geography is more difficult than A-level science because they should draw a conclusion depending on the hypothesis in IGCSE.
Okay, yes. Often what students will have to do is look at their initial hypothesis, or sometimes in science we call it a prediction, and then at the very end justify whether or not their experimental results backed up that prediction or contradicted it, supported it or contradicted it. Yeah. Incidentally, mentioning coursework, coursework is not an option for Cambridge. Even at IGCSE, the options are the practical paper or the alternative to practical paper.
One more question. So how could you develop your own mark scheme for the planning?
Okay, good question. I would start with those success criteria, right? And then start to break it down into the way you would like to see students detailing the answers. Your mark scheme does not have to be the same as a Cambridge exam paper mark scheme. So for example, you could say 1 mark for just naming the independent variable, 1 mark then for giving the range and number of data that you would take, and then 1 mark for saying how you will actually vary that, and then maybe another mark for saying some strategy to ensure that that's accurate.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. That was a great Q&A session, actually.
Okay, good. So what we're doing now is looking at the aims and objectives again as we start to draw to a close. And what I'd like you to do is just review these aims and objectives together with any personal objectives that you wrote down or thought about at the start, and think about whether or not we achieved those. Okay. So finally, thanks ever so much for giving up your time today. And I hope that you got something useful from that session. And if even just one of you got something useful, then it's been worth my while doing it, definitely, because that's what it's all about, helping people to help their students. The email address is there. That's the official email address for correspondence with Collins. And I'll just say thank you once more. And I think you should thank each other as well for the positive inputs that you've had on the chat box. That's been very useful.